Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. Now, before I begin, tell me where you're watching from. I'd love to know which cities and towns are joining me for this memory that stayed with me for years. I still remember the late afternoon light filtering through my living room windows the day it happened. It was one of those quiet, ordinary days when nothing seems remarkable until something unexpected shifts the air. I was wiping down the kitchen counter, humming to myself, when there was a soft knock on my door. Not hurried, not loud, just gentle enough to make me pause. When I opened it, I saw him standing there, my ex-boyfriend's son. Taller than I remembered, shoulders slightly hunched, one hand gripping the strap of his backpack, as if it were the only thing keeping him steady. He looked so much older than the teenager I used to see shuffling around their hallway years ago. His face had that hesitant softness people carry when they're not sure if they're welcome. I felt a wave of memories rush back. Holidays, shared dinners, small arguments, the quiet goodbyes. And then here he was in front of me, breathing a little too quickly, eyes darting to the side before finally meeting mine. "I'm sorry to show up like this," he said, shifting his weight. "I didn't know where else to go for a minute." His voice carried something fragile underneath, something that pulled me instantly into concern. I stepped aside, motioning him in. He hesitated, then walked past me, his backpack brushing lightly against my arm. I could feel how tense he was, how uncertain. The room felt different with him in it, as if time had folded and brought pieces of the past right into my quiet living room. He stood awkwardly near the table, both hands now gripping the straps of his backpack. I watched him for a moment, studying the way he seemed to brace himself before speaking. "I was in the neighborhood," he said quietly, though we both knew that wasn't the full truth. People rarely show up at old doors unless something inside them is stirring. I offered him a seat and brewed tea, trying to give him space to gather whatever he had come to share. When I placed the cup in front of him, he let out a breath he'd been holding. His fingers trembled slightly as he wrapped them around the warm mug. He looked around the room like he was searching for pieces of his childhood, or perhaps trying to understand why he felt drawn back to someone from a chapter he thought was closed. "You were always kind to me," he finally said, eyes fixed on the steam rising from his cup. More than most people realized. That sentence held weight, more than he probably intended. I felt my chest tighten a little. I remembered those years vividly. The trying, the supporting, the wishing things had turned out differently for all of us. He continued, swallowing hard, his grip on the backpack strap tightening again. "I didn't come to talk about him," he said. "I came because something happened today, and it made me think of you." His words hung in the room like the faint echo of a door opening somewhere inside both of us. I leaned in gently, giving him the silence he needed to continue. He seemed grateful for it. He shifted his backpack onto his lap, holding it almost like a shield, his eyes growing distant as he prepared to share whatever had brought him here. At that moment, I felt a quiet stillness settle around us, a sense that whatever he was about to say would change the way I remembered him, and maybe even the way I remembered myself. He sat there for a long moment, his hands still gripping the edges of his backpack, like it was the only thing keeping him steady. I didn't rush him. Something in his posture, in the quiet tension across his shoulders, told me he needed space more than anything else. When he finally lifted his eyes to mine, there was a softness there, a tiredness that didn't belong on someone so young. "I had a rough day," he began, voice steady but faint. "Not the kind you can just shake off." He paused, swallowing thickly. "And it reminded me of how you used to talk to me. How you made things feel lighter." Those words struck deeper than I expected. I remembered the small things, the way he used to stand hesitantly by the kitchen doorway when something bothered him, waiting for an invitation to speak. The way his father never noticed those quiet signals, always too wrapped up in his own world. Back then, I would gently coax him to sit, to share, to breathe. I never realized it had stayed with him. He set his backpack down on the floor beside him, but one hand remained resting on it, as if he still needed the comfort of holding on to something familiar. His voice grew steadier as he went on. "There was this moment earlier today," he said. "I was talking to someone who reminded me a little of you. Not in looks, but in the way they listened. It made me think of how safe I felt when I talked to you." Safe. That word lingered between us. It warmed something inside me, something I didn't even realize had cooled over the years. I pulled out the chair across from him and sat quietly, letting him know I was there, fully and without expectation. He exhaled slowly, as if that simple act of sitting with him allowed him to release a weight he'd been carrying for far too long. "I don't know why I came here today," he said, staring at the table, fingers slowly tracing the wood grain. "Maybe I just wanted to remember a time when someone actually understood me." His honesty was disarming. Not dramatic, not emotional in the way people sometimes force themselves to appear. Just real. Vulnerable. Human. The kind of honesty that makes you feel the urge to reach across the table, not to fix anything, but simply to acknowledge the courage it took to say it. I nodded gently. "Sometimes we go back to the last place we felt steady," I said, "even if we don't realize we're doing it." That made him smile faintly, and for a moment he looked like the boy I remembered. Soft features, uncertain eyes, a quiet hopefulness buried beneath everything else. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair, the tension in his posture easing just a little. "Do you ever think about those days?" he asked. "About us? All the pieces we were all trying to hold together." His question caught me off guard, not because it was inappropriate, but because it was so honest. I did think about those days, more often than I wanted to admit. About the laughter, the quiet evenings, the moments of connection that seemed to slip through our fingers, despite how hard we tried. "I do," I answered softly. "Not every day, but enough to wonder how everyone turned out." He let out a small laugh, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Well, I'm still figuring that part out." There was something profoundly moving about watching him try to carry more than someone his age should, but there was also something reassuring about the fact that he had come to me, not for solutions, but for grounding, for familiarity, for something he remembered as comforting. He pulled his backpack closer again, resting both hands on it as if preparing himself to share the real reason he came. "Before I tell you the rest," he said, looking at me with a seriousness that made my breath catch, "I need you to know I didn't come here because of him. This has nothing to do with what happened between you two." I nodded, silently encouraging him to continue. "I came because today, something happened that made me realize I never thanked you for what you meant to me back then." His voice cracked slightly, but he didn't look away. "And I think it's time I tell you why." Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. And before I continue, tell me where you're watching from. I always enjoy knowing which towns and cities are sharing these quiet memories with me. For a moment, the room felt impossibly still, like even the air had paused to listen. He sat across from me, both hands resting on his backpack, his eyes holding something deeper than simple gratitude. I leaned forward slightly, not wanting to pressure him, but letting him know I was fully present. It took him a few more seconds, but eventually he spoke, carefully, as though each word carried years of unsaid feelings. "You probably didn't realize it at the time," he said, voice steady but soft, "but you were the first person who ever made me feel heard." The simplicity of the statement caught me off guard. Not dramatic, not emotional in an exaggerated way, just true. That quiet kind of truth that opens old rooms inside the heart. I let his words settle, remembering the small moments he must have meant. The afternoons when he'd linger in the kitchen doorway. The times I'd ask about his day when no one else did. the silent car rides where I'd let him talk at his own pace without pushing. He lifted his backpack onto his lap, unzipping it halfway, then stopping as if he wasn't quite ready to reveal whatever he had inside. Instead, he looked up at me again. "I don't think my dad ever noticed the way you tried," he said. But I did. I noticed everything. There was no bitterness in his voice, just observation. A quiet maturity that felt surprising coming from someone who once barely spoke above a whisper. He looked down, tracing the fabric of the bag with his thumb. There were days back then when things were rough at home. Days when I felt like I was walking on eggshells. He paused, letting the weight of the memory pass through him. "You were the only part of that time that felt steady." I felt a warmth spread through my chest. Not the kind that comes from pride, but the kind that comes from realizing you mattered more than you ever knew. I'd been trying so hard back then, trying to hold together a relationship that was slipping, trying to make sure he didn't feel invisible in the process. Hearing him acknowledge it after all these years touched me more than I expected. He took a slow breath and opened the backpack a little more. Inside was a folder, edges worn, corners bent. Something he had carried for a while. He pulled it out gently, holding it with both hands before placing it on the table between us. "This is why I came today," he said. My eyes moved over the folder. It looked old enough to belong to the years when we all lived under the same roof of hopeful, complicated attempts. I didn't reach for it right away. I wanted him to guide the moment. He tapped the top of it lightly. "I found this while cleaning my room," he said, his voice quieting. "It's things from school, pictures, notes, little things I didn't think mattered at the time." He paused, but I kept them, because they reminded me of when I felt safe. He pushed the folder toward me, not forcefully, but with a kind of gentle trust. I opened it carefully, the paper inside crackling faintly. There were small drawings from when he was younger, a few old assignments, and, tucked between the pages, a photo. It was him, younger, smiling slightly while holding a project he'd been proud of, and behind him, partly in the frame, was... He pushed the folder toward me, not forcefully, but with a kind of gentle trust. I'd opened it carefully, the paper inside crackling faintly. There were small drawings from when he was younger, a few old assignments, and, tucked between the pages, a photo. It was him, younger, smiling slightly while holding a project he'd been proud of, and behind him, partly in the frame, was me. I remembered that day. He had worked so hard on that project, staying up late to finish it. I had helped him organize the poster board, encouraging him to believe in his own ideas. His father had barely glanced at it, but I had taken a picture, thinking the moment mattered. He watched my reaction closely, his shoulders softening when he saw the recognition in my face. "That picture," he said quietly, "was the first time I ever felt proud of myself, because you told me I should be." A silence settled between us, gentle, filled with understanding rather than awkwardness. I placed the photo down carefully, letting my fingertips rest on the edge for a moment before looking back at him. "I never knew it meant that much," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his expression warm but serious. "It did, more than I knew how to explain back then." He closed the backpack slowly, letting it drop to the floor beside him. Then he sat up a little straighter. "And today," he said, "when I had that moment, when someone looked at me the way you once did, I realized I needed to come here. I needed to tell you what you were to me, because I don't think I ever will forget it." His voice didn't waver. He wasn't speaking as a boy anymore, but as someone who had carried years of unspoken gratitude and finally found the courage to release it. And in that quiet living room, with the fading afternoon light painting soft gold across the table, I felt something unfold inside me. A return of warmth. A recognition of how deeply our lives can touch each other, often without us ever realizing the impact we leave behind. but I also sensed there was more. The way he looked at me, steady, searching, told me he hadn't reached the heart of his confession yet. There was still something he was holding back, something that had brought him to my door after all these years. He sat there for a moment after I finished looking through the folder, as if gathering the courage to take the final step into whatever truth he still carried. The soft evening light had shifted warmer, casting long shadows across the table. I could hear the faint hum of cars outside, the distant rhythm of ordinary life, continuing on while something deeply personal unfolded quietly inside my living room. He took a slow breath, one of those breaths people take when they're ready to reveal something that's been sitting inside them for far too long. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but there was a hint of vulnerability behind every word. "There's something I've never told anyone," he said. "Not my friends, not my family, not even him." He meant his father. The silence after the word felt heavy, but honest. He folded his hands together, leaning slightly forward. His eyes met mine with a sincerity that almost startled me. "Back then," he said softly, "I always felt like I was trying to make myself smaller, trying not to take up too much space, trying not to bother anyone." He paused, pressing his lips together. "But with you, I didn't feel like that. You made room for me without even realizing it." He rubbed his thumb slowly across the back of his hand, grounding himself before continuing. "The truth is, I kept coming back to that memory today because I realized something." Another breath. "You were the first adult who ever made me feel worthy. Not because I achieved something, not because I acted a certain way, just because I existed." His words were not dramatic. They were gentle, almost quiet, but they carried a depth that made my chest tighten. "And when I thought about that," he continued, "I realized I've been searching for that same feeling ever since. That sense of calm, that sense of being seen. And I didn't find it until today, when I talked to someone who reminded me of you." He hesitated then, looking down for a moment before raising his eyes again. "But even then, it wasn't the same. It made me realize something I didn't expect." His voice softened even further. "I realized that the reason it felt familiar wasn't because they were like you. It was because you're still the person I compare that feeling to." The honesty in his statement wrapped around the room in a quiet, steady warmth. Not romantic, not dramatic, just deeply human. A connection resurfacing after years of silence. I let his words settle before responding, choosing my voice carefully so he could hear the sincerity. "I never knew you carried all of that," I said, "but I'm glad you told me, and I'm glad you felt you could." He nodded, his shoulders easing for the first time since he had arrived, but there was something else behind his eyes, something hopeful and uncertain all at once. "There's one more thing," he said, almost whispered, "and I hope it doesn't sound strange." I held his gaze, steady and open. "Go on." He took another deep breath. "When I came here today, I didn't just come to thank you." He paused, searching for the right words. "I came because I wanted to know if, after all these years, you still see me as that quiet kid from back then." The question hovered between us, delicate and sincere. He wasn't searching for validation. He wasn't asking me to rewrite the past. He was asking if I could see him as he was now, a grown young man finding his place in the world, carrying echoes of our shared years, but not defined by them. I smiled gently. "I see who you are now," I said, "and I see how far you've come." Something shifted in his expression, relief, gratitude, an easing of a burden he'd been holding without even realizing it. "And I'm proud of who you've become." The words reached him. I could tell by the way his breath caught slightly, the way his shoulders finally relaxed. He sat back in his chair, letting out a slow exhale. "I didn't know how much I needed to hear that," he said quietly. We talked for a long time after that, not about the past, not about his father, but about his life now, his hopes, the things he had learned about himself. And I listened, not out of obligation or nostalgia, but because I genuinely cared. By the time he stood to leave, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the room bathed in the soft glow of the lamp on the table. He picked up his backpack and held it like it meant something different now, not a shield, but a reminder of how far he had come. At the door, he turned back to me. "Thank you for everything you were back then," he said, "and for today." I gave him a warm smile. "You're welcome. And my door is always open if you ever need a place to breathe." He nodded, his eyes holding a quiet gratitude that felt like a closing chapter reached peacefully. Then he stepped outside, the cool night air drifting into the doorway for a moment before I gently closed it behind him. As I stood in the quiet of my home, I realized something too. Sometimes the past doesn't return to haunt us or trouble us. Sometimes it returns simply to thank us, to remind us that even in the chapters we thought were forgotten, we touched someone's life more deeply than we ever knew. And sometimes that reminder is enough to warm the heart for years to come.